here's the abstract that I sent in. The courts have struggled for decades to decide when a districting plan is excessively skewed. New technical methods, comparing a plan to an ensemble drawn from the space of all possible maps, might provide the needed breakthrough and have had an excellent track record in court in the past year. I'll survey the recent developments and turn an eye on Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, especially Pennsylvania. Okay, so let me just start with this, the original gerrymander. So I'm going to give not that much in the way of background, but you kind of have to start here, especially because, you know, I teach here. That's to scale. That's a well-known political cartoon from 1812. It shows a congressional district in the North Shore of Boston, which was approved by founding father and then governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry. For me, what's notable about, well, a few things are notable about this, the original gerrymander. It was satirized as reptilian or dragon-like, and so called Gerry's salamander, which gave us the portmanteau gerrymander. One of the things that's interesting for me about this is, you know, the cartoonists needed wings and claws and fangs to kind of heighten that intuition that the shape was fishy. And it's supposed to make you feel that it's drawn the way it's drawn in order to rig an outcome. In a sense, that's true. It was drawn to favor one political party, at the time the Democratic Republicans, over the other, the Federalists. And of course, the way it does that is by trying to carefully enclose area just so that your favored party will be an efficient majority, right? It worked. It got a Democratic Republican elected to Congress, but Gerry himself was voted out because you can't gerrymander the governorship. One of the things, though, that's interesting about this from a modern point of view is that it doesn't look, it looks pretty benign, right? It's just like kind of, you know, collar counties. It's got some cohesion in terms of what kinds of people live there, and the shape isn't, it really needs the wings and the claws and the teeth to look scary, because it, but these are all congressional districts from the last cycle. Probably you recognize some of them. And the idea here is that these crazy shapes are supposed to be a red flag to some sort of intent, some sort of agenda that's being advanced by the respective legislatures. Okay, so let's take a quick look at these pictures. So that's Florida, Pennsylvania, Maryland. This one's going up to the Supreme Court next week. These two are North Carolina, and that's Illinois. Yep, it's Chicago. It's the so-called earmuffs district. And without spending too much time on each of these, each has a really interesting story. And when you start getting interested in gerrymandering, and you see one of these shapes, you go digging a little bit for the story. In some cases, the story is incredibly easy to uncover. That famous Pennsylvania district there in the top middle, that's suburbs of Philadelphia, and it's clearly a carefully constructed, narrowly Republican district that is built by kind of stringing together. It's 88% white. It's built by carefully avoiding some black neighborhoods. You know, you can, it sort of tells the story of its own design fairly readily when you start to, when you lay it over the demographics and start to ask the question of how it looks the way it looks. The one in Chicago is built by taking two different Latino neighborhoods in the city. In the south, that's Pilsen, which has a Mexican-American community. In the north, that's Humboldt Park, which is the center of the city's Puerto Rican population. And they're strung together along a highway to create a district. In this case, you have to ask to what end. So it ends up being what's called packed. So this is one of the kind of signature tactics of gerrymandering, is if you're trying to minimize the electoral impact of a voting group, you might pack them into a district with wastefully high numbers. And this particular district in Illinois has elected Luis Gutierrez 13 consecutive times, never with less than 75% of the vote, right, which is sort of wasteful vote margins. And so at first it looks like it's packing intended to dilute the influence of Latinos, but then you say, wait a second, who's drawing districts in Illinois, right? And ultimately what it turns out as you research that particular district is that it's a well-meaning opportunity district that was intended to actually create the opportunity to elect a candidate of choice for the Latino community while not sacrificing 3 nearby African American districts that lock together with this one. And it was thought at the time of its creation that it had to look this bad. Hi, yeah, come on in. That the shape had to be sacrificed in order to achieve that other end. Okay, so actually one of the points that I'm going to be trying to develop in this talk is that the space of possibilities for districts, the space of districting plans is so big and so complicated that, you know, throughout our history, people haven't fully understood the possibilities, right? In particular, the civil rights advocates who contributed to drawing that district were factually wrong about what was necessary in order to create the 4 kinds of opportunity districts that they were looking for. Okay, so each of these has a story, and I could go on at great length, but let me not. Let me just say that what you're looking at in this picture, once again, is a kind of holdover of that idea from 1812 that bad shapes are a red flag for agenda-driven districting, right? But what I want to argue is that the eyeball test is going out of business. And I'll tell you a little bit about why, but it brings us to a moment in the history of attempting to adjudicate gerrymandering that's a sticky one because we need new tests. And I hope that that's where the kinds of methods that I want to tell you about today come in. Okay, so first let me argue that we don't need our districts to look quite that bad anymore. By the way, there's space up here, I'm just saying, if you guys want. Okay, so what you see here is screenshots from actual redistricting software. And what you're looking at is many, many different ways if you're the one who's trying to draw a plan of like visualizing the information that you need to craft a precisely performing plan, all right? So as a districtor, you can see census demographics, you can see, you can purchase from companies like Catalyst all kinds of predictive analytics, likelihood of voting, likely party preference, lots of information about income, about political donations, right? So you can get all of this very precise information. Interestingly, maps are still built by hand. Actually, that's something that I hear a lot when I talk to people and ask them, how do you think gerrymanders are made? A lot of people think there are gerrymandering algorithms already in use and some sort of big red button that people, especially Republicans apparently in the public imagination, can press the big red button and create an extreme gerrymander. That's not actually yet how it's done. So you have all these analytics, but the way gerrymanders, or I should say districting plans, are still made is by hand with a person with a mouse going click, 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 and sort of flipping little pieces of a map back and forth and then watching the analytics update in real time until the plan performs as they desire. Okay. However, these days you get, as I wrote on this slide, you can get extreme performance with shapes that don't sear the eye. So let me try to show you a little bit about how that looks. Okay, so first let me throw out the magic word compactness. There are a number of traditional districting principles which in some cases are written into state constitutions or into statute. In other places are just tradition, but are sort of have some precedential value for courts. And one of those important traditional districting principles is called compactness. And compactness is just a very fuzzy shape criterion. It just means the shapes should look reasonable, usually. 37 states have some sort of compactness rule on the books, but very few of them try to define it or quantify, operationalize it. And the ones that do, actually, I've read all of the descriptions, and they're usually nonsense or incoherent or ill-defined. I count one state that has a definition you could actually use, which is Colorado, that tells you to sum all the perimeters of the districts, and that's your compactness score. That's not a great score, but it's a definition. It's a thing, right? And in most other cases, it's just really how they look. So yeah, here's my Rorschach plots. So an example is that Utah, in the last redistricting cycle, they did something very cool. They created a website called redistrictutah.com where anyone could submit plans. You could submit plans for the legislature, for the congressional seats, or for the school boards, districts, right? And they just had a list of requirements for your plan. And they said they'd consider anything that passed all their requirements. Well, one of the requirements on that list was compactness. And I had an opportunity to ask some of the legislative staffers who had put this contest together, great, how did you measure compactness? And they said, oh, we just threw out the ugly ones, right? And I think like in practice, that's what compactness has meant. It hasn't meant anything rigorous. I should add, and it's kind of, I think, important, I got interested in redistricting, so I'm a pure mathematician, my background's in geometry and topology. I got interested in redistricting through compactness because I started thinking, hey, shape analysis, we know how to do that. Maybe there's new ideas. And actually, I think part of my working group's contribution has been some new ideas for compactness. But what I've learned going along is that there's so much other opportunity for mathematical interventions, even geometric interventions. And so compactness has become only a small part of what it is that we think about. The political science literature has well over 30 competing definitions of compactness in it. Let me just mention the two most popular, and then this is part of an extended argument that none of these definitions has ever convinced a court or a legislature that it's the kind of right one, and they're less useful than ever, the classical definitions of compactness. So what are they? Just two quick examples, the things that you see the most in expert testimony. One's called the Polsby-Popper score. It's basically area divided by perimeter squared. So that's as though what matters about a district is its contour, right? And the idea is the wigglier the boundary, the more likely you're trying to do a thing, right? So you penalize districts that have long boundary relative to how much area is enclosed. Behind the scenes there is an isoparametric theorem from the 19th century, well, from antiquity, but proved in the 19th century, that says area over perimeter squared is actually bounded above and below for all shapes. And so it gives you a score with a defined range. Make sense? Okay. It's not great for redistricting, though, because both area and perimeter aren't that meaningful, I think, when it comes to what's salient politically, what it is that we want to measure. So like, for the example, suppose you have two districts and there's some lake that could be assigned to one or the other. That contributes to area, but it doesn't contribute anything politically meaningful to either one. Suppose you have a really windy coastline. Virginia has plenty of that. So that penalizes whatever district is part of the coastline. Anyway, there's all kinds of problems that I don't need to go into, but they've contributed to why people stay fuzzy and have stuck with the eyeball test for actually using compactness in practice. I'll just mention the second most popular compactness score. It's called the Rioch score. And it says you take your district, you take its smallest circumscribing circle, and you take the ratio of their areas. Right? So it's kind of measuring how indented is your district with respect to a circle that encloses it. It's also pretty bad at corresponding to anything meaningful, in my semi-professional opinion. An interesting story about Rioch is that the way it took off is that Maptitude for Redistricting, which is the industry-leading software that people use, one of the screenshots I showed you before was from Maptitude, they built it in as a function that you could assess with the press of a button, and it took off from there. So that's the technology leading the way in a kind of interesting way. The kind of good news is I've gotten to know the folks at Maptitude, and they're open to new compactness scores, and hopefully they can similarly take off in that way. Okay, so how did this turn out for Utah? Here's how. Bottom left, you can see the current congressional map of Utah. It's got 4 districts. They look fine to me. Those don't look, there's no smoking gun there. But what does it do? In the other picture, you see Salt Lake City, which is, of course, like the blue area of Utah. And Salt Lake City is split into not 1, not 2, not 3, but all 4 congressional districts touch Salt Lake City. And so the effect is to do the dual strategy to packing, which is called cracking. So cracking is when you take population that would have been enough to control a district and you split it up so that it is unable to control a district. And in the case of Utah, Democrats got 33% of the congressional vote, but none of the 4 seats. Okay. Right, so you can gerrymander in the sense of controlling the outcome without ugly shapes. All you need to do here is split Salt Lake enough ways, and it doesn't matter what the shapes are that do it. Okay. Great, so eyeball compactness alone won't save us. But let's take a look at how that plays out. So this is an image that you may have seen. It was circulating a lot around the time of the North Carolina cases. And you see here, like the old map of North Carolina on the wall, and it looks really terrible and scary. And in this gentleman's hand is a much nicer looking new map. And what ended up happening is that North Carolina's legislature was required to redraw their map, and they came up with a much better looking one that was just as extremely performing. So here's a quote from the chairman of the GOP in North Carolina. He said, "That's our new map is not a gerrymander. It can't be, because a gerrymander is by definition and common understanding a strange-looking monster drawing." Right? And PolitiFact, as you see, rated that mostly false. Supported that with this quote: "These days, with incredibly rich data available to the line drawers, very skewed districts no longer have to look like exotic reptiles with fangs and claws." And that was me. I'm going to try to convince you that you can now assess the performance to be extreme without relying on the test of what the shapes look like to your eyes. Okay, so let's move to Pennsylvania, and then we'll come back to North Carolina, and I'll show you how that plays out. Here are, but so far, though, I'm moving a little fast. Any questions? Okay, maybe I'm not moving a little fast. All right. What you see here is 4 maps of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has 18 congressional districts. And I don't know how well you can see this, but top left is the map that the Republican-controlled legislature enacted in 2011. Actually, it's really important, though, I haven't said this yet, I want to stop and say, many of the gerrymanders that I'm looking at in the last cycle are Republican-favoring gerrymanders around the country. And it's important to say that there's a reason for that, which is opportunity right now. So traditionally, the power to draw and approve a congressional map and a legislative map is given to the legislatures of the individual states. 2 states have outsourced that to fully independent commissions, which are California and Arizona, but mostly it's the purview of the legislature. And at the moment, 26 out of 50 states have a Republican trifecta, which is control of both halves of the legislature plus the governorship. So that means total control of the map drawing process. 26 out of 50 states compared to 8 for Democrats. So at the moment, there's a real disproportion of opportunity to gerrymander. The Democrats are, of course, veteran gerrymanderers when they have the opportunity, just to be clear. Okay. All right, but let's go back to looking at a nice, good old Republican gerrymander here. So top left is a map that was enacted by the Pennsylvania legislature in 2011. And it looks pretty horrible. I like to call this kind of picture tumors and fractals. That's what you're seeing here. And we'll zoom in and look at some of its properties in a little bit. But just as in North Carolina, that map was thrown out and the legislature was told, try again. Interestingly, many of you may know this if you've been following these cases, the North Carolina case was a federal case. It was brought in district court. And even though the maps were thrown out and redrawn, it was stayed by the Supreme Court while they're thinking about other gerrymandering cases this season. The Pennsylvania challenge was in state court. It went up to the state Supreme Court, which carefully worded its decision and threw out that map on the basis of the state constitution. So they were trying really scrupulously to avoid the US Supreme Court stepping in. And it worked. So an incredibly frenzied process was kicked off because with an election coming up, the primaries will be in May, there was just an absolute rush to create new maps. So the state court said, okay, legislature, try again. See if you and the governor can agree. I hear it's split control because the legislature is Republican and the governor is a Democrat. See if you can agree. And if not, we'll appoint this special master to the name of an outside expert appointed by the court. And they chose a Stanford law professor named Nate Pursley, who's a old seasoned pro in the special master business. He was also the special master in North Carolina. They said, okay, if you guys can't agree, then it's Professor Pursley's job to draw a remedial map. And for good measure, the state Supreme Court said, everyone can submit a map. Go, everybody. It just has to adhere to the following criteria. I think it's interesting. Let me throw out the criteria that they named. So they said population equality. And that's nationally the redistricting principle that's taken the most seriously. I would say to the point of a fetish, right? So we know from the 1960s, from Reynolds v. Sims, followed by Baker v. Carr, that the 14th Amendment is supposed to apply to redistricting in the form of one person, one vote. Right? And that's supposed to give us, that's been interpreted over time as giving us representational equality. So congressional districts are supposed to have the same census population in them, not the same number of voters, not the same number of registered voters, not even the same number of eligible voters, but the same census population, which includes people too young to vote, includes non-citizens, includes undocumented residents, right? And that's what's trying to be equalized here so that each representative represents the same number of people, right? Representational equality, not vote weight equality per se, right? Make sense? Okay, so how close are you supposed to be to equality? Well, New Jersey had a map invalidated by a court for 0.7% population deviation between districts, which is kind of crazy. And so these days, the actual common practice around the country is an insane thing called zeroing out, where the population is taken to within one person. Yeah. So Pennsylvania, I can tell you the number. Boy, I've been thinking a lot about Pennsylvania for the last month or two. So if you take the population, the 2010 census population of Pennsylvania, and you divide it by 18, you get 705,687 point something. And so each of the 18 districts has population either 705,687 or 705,688. And obviously, so that's population equality. And the one-person deviation becomes...
Those are all estimates, right?
Well, that's what's so nuts, right? So the census is clearly just, doing their best job to estimate. And the census is using statistical correction and other techniques, right? But the point is we adopt the fiction supplied by the census enumeration for 10 whole years, right? It's 2018. That was 2010 census, right? And that's what we're trying to equalize, right? So that's what I mean when I say it's taken to the level of a fetish, and it becomes an excuse, it becomes an excuse to hide lots of other bad behavior. So actually, let me rewind a little bit and go back to, so you see that crazy district in Maryland there, top right? It looks really ghastly, but it was defended by one of the heads of the redistricting committee there by saying, oh, we didn't mean for it to look that way. We were trying to equalize population. Right? Okay. All right, where were we?
You were saying the criteria in Pennsylvania, but you only got to one.
I only got to one, but it's one that requires attention. Yes, but then there were a few others, and here they are. Next, they said the district should be compact. And then they listed 5 different compactness scores with no indication of which was the most important or how to combine them. 5 different compactness scores that they said had to be reported by anyone submitting a plan. So they said, tell us your Polsby-Popper score, your Rioch score, and Schwartzberg, convex hull, and population polygon for good measure. What does this mean? It's pretty much just a gesture at something quantitative because there's no indication of how it ranks in relative importance with the other listed criteria, or which of those 5 scores prevails, or how to combine the 5, or anything. Even, with something like Polsby-Popper, that's well defined for an individual district. So now what's the Polsby-Popper score of a whole plan? Do you add them? Do you take the biggest or smallest? Just totally left open. And that's why I think it really serves as just a gesture at something quantitative, which is kind of a bummer, right? Yeah. So population, compactness. Next, and an interesting one, splits. So don't split counties or municipalities any more than you have to. Okay, again, what does that mean, right? Okay, but that's listed. Let's see if I'm leaving anything out. I mean, I believe those are the only things listed in the court order. Let's see if we come to anything else as we go. There are other traditional districting principles, such as preserving communities of interest. That's considered traditional, not listed in the court order. Nationally, we're bound, all of us, when we redistrict, by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so it doesn't need to be listed in the court order, it's just a law. But Pennsylvania is a super interesting case. It's the only state that's got all this redistricting litigation going on right now in which there's never been a voting rights lawsuit. There's never been a VRA lawsuit. So that means that for someone like me who's trying to analyze plans, there's no racially polarized voting analysis on the books there, right? It's really kind of a blank slate when it comes to the Voting Rights Act. So we can talk about the VRA much more if anyone's interested. But it's, whereas in states like Texas, North Carolina, certainly, even Wisconsin, we have like clear voting rights districts. It's a little bit murkier how to respect and comply with the Voting Rights Act in Pennsylvania, but you have to take it into account. Great, so that's the scenario. Now, here are the 3 plans that I want to discuss a little bit. Here's the new proposed plan of the legislature. I'm sometimes going to call this the TS plan. It was made by Terzai, or was put forward by Terzai and Scarnati, who are 2 legislators in Pennsylvania. Here's the governor's counter-proposed plan, and let me emphasize I did not make it. I had nothing to do with the making of that. I was hired to assess maps, not to build them. It's a totally different skill set. I was actually firewalled away from the creation of this map, but asked to score it, as we'll discuss. And then you won't be surprised to hear that in that very condensed timeline, the legislature and the governor couldn't, in fact, agree on a new map. And so Nate Pursley did draw a new map. That's the remedial plan. It was February 19th. It was submitted. The state Supreme Court approved it. And then, as you guys probably know, just in the last few days, the last challenges have been swatted away. And this is the new map that will be voted under in May. Okay. So what I submit to you, so we're in the whole death of the eyeball test phase of this presentation. I don't think you can see any difference in quality between the last 3. Tell me if I'm wrong, if you think one of them sort of looks worse than the others. I will tell you that on those 5 compactness metrics that I discussed, they're all kind of comparable. They're all amazingly good at not splitting counties. There are 67 counties in Pennsylvania, and 3 of them have to be split because they're bigger than a congressional district. And these maps all split 15 or 16 counties, which is really good. Okay.
The little lines are townships then, or what?
The lines that you see here, yeah, no, these are VTDs. Okay, so actually, I think I have another slide on this coming up, but let me take a moment to explain that now. So when you build a plan and when you want to understand its partisan performance, you might want to build it out of voting precincts. And that's because it's at the precinct level that election returns are reported, right? So if you want to see the performance of a plan, that's a relevant level for your data. Pennsylvania, okay, the census proposes things called VTDs, or voting tabulation districts. And those are like given to the states as possible precincts. Hey, consider using these for your precincts, right? Many but not all states adopt those initially for their precincts, but precincts change over the course of the census cycle. Sometimes for very good reasons, like a city annexes more territory and so has to change its voting precincts. Sometimes to balance population a little bit better, and sometimes for who knows what reason. but precincts do change in between elections. Okay, so I'll come to this a little bit later. It's an enormous data challenge when you're trying to do this kind of work to figure out how the precincts are changing, to figure out the precinct geometry, because you need to know where the votes are located if you want to see how they sit under different possible plans. Pennsylvania is a data disaster when it comes to this. It is not even, the state does not even maintain shapefiles of its precinct geometry. It's not even that they won't give it to you. You get on the phone with the Secretary of State, I've done this experiment, and he'll say, I wish I could help you. But the precinct geometry is known at the county level. And when you call the county and ask for it, if you're lucky, they'll send you shapefiles. And if you're not lucky, they'll send you paper with highlighter, right? And with the whole cycle of my work on this was 2.5 weeks, beginning to end. That's simply not enough time to get reasonable precinct geometry, which you need to do this kind of analysis. So part of the, we're in a moment when there's lots of attention on gerrymandering and redistricting reform. And this has to be one of the places that we look for reform is cleaner, more regular, more accessible data, because otherwise this kind of work becomes incredibly difficult. So what you're seeing is the VTDs, the voting tabulation districts, i.e. some pretty good approximation of what the precincts look like in 2011. Okay? There were 9,500 of them in the state. The first thing you do when you try to do an analysis like this is you clean those up, because some of them are kind of vestigial. They have 0 people. Some of them are totally contained inside other ones. And before you're going to do any kind of geometric analysis, you have to clean those up. So you sort of merge the 0 population ones into their neighbors. You merge the totally contained ones. You make things nicer before you go. When you do that to Pennsylvania, the number 9,500 drops to about 9,000. And I'll show you how important those are for the kind of analysis that I want to do. Any other comments or questions about these maps before we go on? Yeah.
When they ask you to assess the map or whatever, did they give you the criteria, or do you get to use your own compactness criteria? You know,
Well, so there were 5.
specify them?
Well, there were 5 that were specified by the court.
Okay.
But I was asked to assess the partisan skew of these maps, right? Okay, so great. So this is an important point too. We only have a legal framework for addressing racial gerrymandering, and that's the one provided by the Voting Rights Act. There is no law against partisan gerrymandering at this time. That's why all this attention is being paid. For 30 plus years, the Supreme Court has tried to come up with a way to handle partisan gerrymandering. I mean, we saw the original gerrymander was a partisan gerrymander. The idea is old. But the court has said repeatedly in Davis v. Bandemere, in Veith, in Lulac v. Perry, repeatedly the Supreme Court has said, we think partisan gerrymandering is justiciable. We think it's our business to worry about it, but we don't know how. After all, it's up to the legislatures to make the plan. Elections have consequences. They should be able to have some sway. The elected officials should be able to have some sway. But how much is too much? And the courts have asked, researchers for tools and standards, and have been so far pretty unsatisfied with the tools and standards that have been proposed. So a partisan symmetry standard was discussed, and I'll talk about that a little more later, was discussed in the Lulac case, and the justices couldn't agree on whether they thought symmetry was sort of a clean, manageable. You don't want every redistricting case to go to the Supreme Court, right? You want some kind of toolkit that enables legislatures themselves or lower courts to handle these cases. And so maybe partisan symmetry wasn't it. In the last few years, a new metric has been proposed called the efficiency gap. How many people here have heard enough about it to maybe say what it is? Okay. I'll define it in a little bit. And the Wisconsin case, the big, blockbuster case this year, Whitford v. Gill v. Whitford, depending on what stage it was at. At the district court level, that was really premised on this new metric called efficiency gap. as it made its way up to the appeals court and then to the Supreme Court, the attorneys backed off efficiency gap as their like go-to metric, and now it's sort of a totality of the evidence kind of case that's being considered. But it was hoped that that was the breakthrough, that would do the trick. Meanwhile, while all of this has been going on, the techniques that I'm here to tell you about today have been like percolating into public consciousness. Scientific consensus has been crystallizing around these sampling techniques that I'm going to be describing. They kind of just missed the boat for Whitford. The timing was just a little bit off even I think by just a few months, actually. But they're known to the court. I helped consult on an amicus brief filed by Eric Lander, which was discussed a lot in oral arguments. That was very gratifying to see, in which he proposes sampling analysis and an outlier approach as the new tool. And several of the justices sort of favorably discussed that in oral arguments. And that sampling analysis has been right at the center of the successful court challenges in North Carolina and in Pennsylvania. And so maybe that's what they've been looking for. We'll soon see. One last comment on that before I go on. What might we see come out of Whitford? What might happen in this case?
Which one is Whitford? I'm sorry.
Okay, so Whitford's the Wisconsin case. It was the first one heard by the court. As I mentioned, they'll hear this Maryland case just next week. They stayed the North Carolina case so in other words, even though Wisconsin is nominally the thing on the docket, what's thought is that the Supreme Court is trying to come up with something that applies to all the different gerrymandering cases percolating up through the country right now. Okay, so Whitford, everyone in this redistricting space is holding their breath on Whitford. Okay, what might we see? Well, we might have seen the court just like embrace the efficiency gap as the new almost definition of partisan gerrymandering. That's not thought to be likely, especially if you read oral arguments, right? Yeah, indeed. They could sort of say, oh, sorry, we're still waiting. No standard yet for partisan gerrymandering. Try again. We'll see you in 30 years. It's possible. But another possible outcome, and one that I'm hopeful about, is that we'll get a kind of slogan outlining a legal framework with details to be filled in by subsequent litigation. That's, after all, what we got out of Baker v. Carr. We got one person, one vote, meaning to be determined, right? The precise quantitative meaning will come through future cases and through future, use. Here, I hope we get a phrase like that, and I would love to see the phrase, extreme outliers are impermissible. So that gives us a framework that says, when does a gerrymander go too far? When compared to the space of what's possible, it's all the way out in the tails. That's the kind of level of specificity I'll be hoping for when we get this decision coming back. Okay, so here again is the 2011 enacted plan, and you can see funny shapes. There's the famous Philly suburbs district, the 7th. Which goes by the name Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. You can't actually see it that well here, but that's a pretty good description of what it looks like. Here, I've zoomed in. So there's Goofy with his ears kicking. I don't know why that's Donald Duck. Okay, so what I'd like to compare that to, so this is Philly, the neighborhood of Philly. And let's look at how the other maps look in the neighborhood of Philly. So this is the new legislative map, the TS map, the governor's map, and Pursley's remedial map. I don't think you can really see a difference. You'd have to know Philly. You'd have to know where are the traditional African American neighborhoods, where are the conservative suburbs. You'd have to sort of know more about what's going on underneath it. All right, your eyeballs just looking at the shapes don't tell you much. Okay, so this is a preview. This is a page from the report that I wrote comparing the properties of these maps, and I'm going to come back and explain a little bit more what's in it. But I just wanted to show this slide at this point to give a little substance to this idea of outlier analysis. So the idea is you'd be comparing a plan to an ensemble of alternative plans, actual other ways of cutting up the state, not an abstract ideal, but available alternatives, legally valid alternatives, ones that, in fact, in this case, as we'll see, meet the districting criteria of the court at least as well as the plan that you're comparing them to.
So the set of objects in the comparison group are all alternative forms of redistricting that satisfy some
That's right.
set of...
That's right. In each case, what you're seeing is a histogram of a billion alternate maps. So here's, for instance, in this picture, here's the governor's map. It's got what the mean median score, which I'll define in a subsequent slide. It's got some score of about 0.03. And here's a histogram. It looks like a smooth curve because there's a billion things in it, right? So
Do they all meet VAR as well, VRA as well?
I'll talk about how I handled VRA compliance. But what does it mean to meet? Yeah, it's a little hard to say, but I did take that into account. But so you see here a billion other ways of redistricting Pennsylvania that meet the court-stated criteria at least as well as this one does. That's what you're seeing in the picture. And so this is not an outlier. And look at the current map. Okay? Yeah.
You use the voting tabulated districts for this?
Yeah, let me show you how I did that. Okay, I'll come back to this slide. It's just a preview of like, so one of the questions that I get a lot about this kind of analysis is like, if the efficiency gap is sociological gobbledygook, like how can you explain a Markov Chain Monte Carlo search of the metagraph of districting partitions? You know, I think that the answer is the idea of an outlier is extremely accessible, right? The idea that, look, here are a bunch of alternatives and this plan is comparable. Here are a bunch of alternatives and this one is so far out you can't even see it as it's in the invisible part of the curve. I actually think this is extremely visually persuasive and rhetorically accessible, but I welcome your views on that. Okay, so we'll come back to exactly what's going on in these pictures. But first, I just want to argue that there's a similar story in North Carolina. So these pictures come from the working group of Jonathan Mattingly at Duke, and they show the 2012 map that the Republican legislature enacted, the 2016 map that the legislature remade under pressure from the court. And the last one on the bottom is a map that was made by a bipartisan panel of retired judges whose goal was just to sort of do things fairly and reasonably and think about actual communities and so on. And again, I would say you can't really see the difference between the 2016 and the judges map in terms of, you know, compactness. But this is how they perform in the Duke team's ensemble. So the Duke team also made a giant computer-generated ensemble of alternative ways to come up, to cut up North Carolina. And this is a gerrymandering index and you can see that they designed, which I can explain if you're interested. And you can see that the 2012 and 2016 maps are just way outliers in terms of how much gerrymandering they produce, while the judges map is right in the curve. Okay, so this is just supposed to reinforce the idea that your eyes can't see partisan performance. Yeah.
So, in your previous graph, your resampled histograms, they were said similar to Gov, similar to...
Yep.
So the resampling scheme depends upon which...
Okay, let me tell you how
you're analyzing?
Yep, I'm gonna come and explain how the analysis works.
But so all of this depends on the user buying the importance of whatever it is that's graphed on the x-axis.
Sure.
Right, so that's the most important. What is the one-dimensional score of gerrymandering or whatever it is that's, you know, that's the basis of comparison of the existing district to the
Yeah.
alternative district?
Right, so I like to think about this as the problem of metrics versus methods. So until this sampling stuff has emerged, it's been the case that people have focused on metrics. In other words, come up with a one-dimensional indicator that tells us whether there is gerrymandering. So I showed two on my slides. They were called mean median and efficiency gap. The Duke team was using a third one that they called gerrymandering index, suggestively named, right? And I can tell you how all of these are measured. Before sampling, the idea was, let's come up with a metric, a score like this, and just say a bad plan is one whose score is too high. So the inventors of efficiency gap said a bad plan is one whose efficiency gap is more than 0.08. They gave a threshold, right? And that's felt problematic to courts because y.08, y.05, right. Also, the efficiency gap, folks would have you believe that 0.08 is the gerrymandering threshold in Pennsylvania and in Alabama, in Pennsylvania in 2018 and in Alabama in 1992 and in every state in time, and that has felt like maybe questionable. So one of the strengths of the sampling approach is, first of all, it's agnostic to your choice of metric. You build an ensemble of alternate maps and then you choose your favorite metric and you see how things score. But also, and crucially, it gives you a baseline for your state with its political geography and its redistricting rules, right? Because you constrain the search by the laws of your state, right? And so the Voting Rights Act is very relevant in Alabama and not so much in Iowa, for example, right? Okay, so let's get to some of the technicality. We're done with the overview. Now let's get to some of the technique. How do you do this? So you start with the units you want to analyze. They could be blocks, they could be precincts, and you build what I call the dual graph. So here's Virginia. It's got 2,372 precincts, or VTDs, and 11 congressional districts, 40 state Senate districts, 100 state House districts. And so you have to partition this graph into that many subgraphs that are connected because it's a traditional principle that districts should be contiguous. I mentioned a little while ago why precincts are a convenient unit when you want to do partisan gerrymandering, because that's where you have election results. But you might want to do something finer. You might want to go down to the census block level, but then your graph is getting awful big. Okay? But that's okay because the data tools that we use for analytics can handle graphs that big. Usually, often. It's a little slower, of course. Okay, so this is the object. And then what do you do to the object? This is what you do. So here's my Markov chain. So I'm doing a random walk in the space of districting plans. What you see in the picture is just a zoom in of a little area where a graph is partitioned into 4 districts. Those are indicated by the different colors. And every step of the chain, every step of the random walk, is taking a node that's on the boundary of one of the districts, and it's considering flipping its district assignment to a neighboring district. You guys see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Okay, so what you actually do when you run one of these is you either hard constrain or soft constrain the search. Let me try to explain. Hard constrain would be like, do the flip only if these binary conditions are met. So when I did the Pennsylvania search, I gave it the hard constraint of 1% population deviation. I can explain more about why I chose that. But I said, accept the proposal if it maintains the population parity within 1%, otherwise don't. You can hard constrain compactness. You can say, I want the Polsby-Popper scores to average less than, more than, 0.4, right? And I'll only accept a proposal if it keeps the Polsby-Popper scores in range. So those are hard constraints. Soft constraint, anyone here know much about MCMC? Okay, great. So by soft constraints here, I mean the use of an energy, like a Gibbs energy, where you have a penalty for how much you're breaking the rules, and you're less likely to take a step. You attach like a sort of weighted random walk. You take a step with a certain probability, and you're less likely to accept something if your scores are getting worse. That's what I mean by soft constraint. And then you do it for like a schmillion steps and you see what happens. Okay, so that's the basic how to vary the districting plan. Okay, so now with that in mind, let me sort of...
Are you starting
yes.
your chains from some specific...
Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 different kinds of analysis, a local and a global search. Okay, for the local search, which is what I did in Pennsylvania, you start with the map you want to evaluate, and you search its neighborhood. That's a local search. For the global search, you actually want to be sure you're wiping out the dependence on your seed. So one of the tests of if you're globally searching effectively will be if you start with qualitatively different maps, do you produce a similar ensemble? Yeah, any other questions? This is great. Like the technical questions, super welcome. Okay. All right, so stepping back for a quick moment, I want to show you an actual Markov chain analysis of a toy example before we move to Pennsylvania. So here's a 10 by 10 grid, and there are lots of different ways you can cut it up. let's do it by hand, and then let's see what a Markov chain analysis tells us about it. So first I need to tell you where the voters are. So I've placed 40% orange squares here, and the other 60% are pink, right? And since I want to cut this 10 by 10 grid into 10 districts, we might expect, if we get a proportional outcome, we might expect orange to win 4 seats. Everybody with me on the setup? Okay, so here's A, here's B, here's C, here's D. Those are different ways of cutting it up. And here's what they produce in terms of the seats. A is 2 safe orange seats and 1 toss-up, 1 50-50. This, which is geometrically, all I've done here is rotate the rectangle configuration, but it's got a very different outcome. 0 safe orange seats and 3 toss-up. This one's got the 4 safe orange seats that we maybe expected. And this one is an orange favoring gerrymander, which took me an hour to build by hand. And it works by packing and cracking the pink side really very meticulously. Okay? All right, and then you can give compactness scores. I won't go into it, but you can give compactness scores for these, and you can wonder if compactness scores do the job of knowing that the 4th one is a gerrymander. They do, actually. They work in this case. Every compactness score blows up for this gerrymander here. But let's see what a sampling approach does. I found this surprising and interesting. So what we did was we ran just a simple Python script that did a random walk in the space of districting plans. Okay, so the state space is districting plans. You start with one way of cutting it up, and then you do what I did before. You flip, 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 flip. And in this case, it was a run of 100,000 steps. And look at what the picture produces. So it's a histogram, just like we expect. It's sort of bell curve-ish. And what it's telling you is that it's much more typical to get 2 or 2.5 seats for orange. In other words, it consistently underperforms its proportions. It's actually, you can see 4 seats is hard and 6 seats is invisible, right? And then here's a kind of more detailed view. This is seated with Plan B. Plan B was one of my rectangular plans. And if I started with that plan and I did 3 runs of 100,000 steps, I get qualitatively similar performing histograms. And here the x-axis is just number of seats. Yeah. Nobody could argue that that's relevant. You know, that's not relevant. Right? Okay, but now to answer your question, maybe B was just a funny place to start. And if I started with something else, I would see something else. So let's start with the extreme gerrymander. Hey, look, I get, it washes out the dependence on where I started, and I get an extremely similar outcome. So this one started with a 1.5 plan, and this one started with 6. But after just 100,000 steps, which by the way takes seconds to run on this terrible laptop, I seem to have returned to some sort of like ground truth about the distribution of possibilities. You guys with me on what this is trying to do? Okay, so yeah.
Is there a way to guarantee it at all?
Oh, good question. Okay, so right. So when you're doing Markov chains, the gold standard is, as you probably know, what's called a mixing theorem. So you're guaranteed that you have these nice ergodic theorems that tell you that there's some stationary distribution on the space, and after you wait enough time, as time goes to infinity, you'll get as close as you want to that stationary distribution. The problem is, we've been using MCMC methods across, different areas of STEM for decades with great success, but in practice we very, very rarely have mixing theorems that certify that we're sampling with the background distribution. This is no exception. So we have heuristics instead, and one remarkable theorem that's coming up that we can use to get statistical significance even if we don't know that we're mixing. Yeah?
Curiosity, have you tried like Hamiltonian Monte Carlo?
No, but be very interested to hear why that would be a good idea in this context.
So there's less autocorrelation in the chains, and so there's less so you're still dependent on, you don't know if it's going to get there, right? So it's not like an analytic alternative, but some of the autocorrelation is there just in terms of time. You don't have to let it run as long.
Cool, let's talk. Yeah. Okay, so I just a little bit more detail. I just want to show you, this is zoomed in on the tail of that distribution. And what it's showing you is just how hard it is to get that gerrymander that I made by hand, right? In fact, here's some numbers So these are 6 different runs, and look at the last row, which is a 6 seats outcome. Even if I started with 6 seats, I sometimes never found another plan with that many. So it's really this like super extreme outlier in this possibility space, right? So this is giving me a sense in which 6 seats is a whole lot for orange team here. Okay, and so then, you know, of course, you have to be really careful about how you use this. So here are my caveats. Nobody's arguing that a good plan has to sit at the highest bar of these histograms. Only that the tails should be off limits, right? Those are really different usage claims. These methods are for analysis, not plan generation. Like, you shouldn't build your new districting plan this way for lots of reasons, including they're built at the precinct level and would have to be zeroed out to be legally compliant anyway, right? But many other reasons. Also, at this point, let me say a word about how I thought about the Voting Rights Act. But generally, these plans should be thought of as a space of alternatives, not as candidates for adoption. Okay, that's my hope for how they'll be used. And you know, both sides of the bell curve are not created equal. You have, even if this is like the ground truth of what's possible, you have a much better reason to be on this side of the bell curve than on that one, which is proportional outcomes might be a goal, even if it's not a rule, right? But giving 1.5 or 1 seat to orange, that's sort of the less defensible side of this bell curve. See what I'm saying? Okay. Quick word on Voting Rights Act compliance. What I did was talk to demographers who understand Philadelphia, figure out where the traditional African American neighborhoods are, and treat those as geographic clusters that the algorithm would try not to split in the same way that it tries not to split counties. After talking to a lot of smart lawyers, I decided that of the various strategies I've heard for getting the algorithms to think about VRA compliance, that was the most legally responsive. Happy to talk more about that if folks are interested. Okay, so let's look at how that...
Stops cracking but not packing.
Well, except that that's 2 neighborhoods of Philadelphia, right? Each of which has several 100,000. So what that promotes is the likelihood that they'll be in separate districts, right? So a packed map of Philadelphia would tend to combine them. Okay, so let me show you what that does. So here's the 9,059 precincts that are left after the cleaning process that I mentioned. And then here's an initial plan that I want to evaluate. So now I'm showing you how to do a local search in plan space, okay? Make 2 to the 30 random flips. Okay, again, that's fast. 2-pound laptop can do 2 to the 30 in 25 minutes. Okay, no supercomputer time needed. Subject to constraints drawn from the initial plan. So let me explain how I handled that. Take a plan you want to analyze, run its compactness scores, constrain the search to be no worse than the plan you start with. Make sense? County splits. Several ways you can handle it. Once again, like I said before, you can hard constrain or soft constrain. One of the things I did here was hard constrain. The new plans are not allowed to split any more counties than the initial plan split, right? So you're really looking for things that adhere to the court-stated principles at least as well as the map you're considering. And that's why in the chart that I'll produce, it'll say similar to initial plan, right? Because the formal properties that I've constrained by are the ones drawn from the initial plan. Okay. Okay, this gives you a local ensemble of maps similar to your initial plan. And so now let me say a bit more about these 2 metrics that I want to emphasize. And I should, start winding down soon. Okay, one popular partisan metric is the mean median score. This has been an idea in statistics since, the 19th century. What it is you take a bunch of numbers and you take the difference between their mean and their median. It's just what it says it is, right? In the context of redistricting, it measures how far short of half of the votes the controlling party can fall, that should say fall, while still having half of the representation. For instance, a score of 0.03 means that 47% vote share will tend to secure 50% seat share. Do you guys see what I'm saying? Okay. So that's supposed to be a measure of partisan skew. The other one is efficiency gap. Nominally, it's about which party wastes more votes. Here's what it turns out to measure if you hit it with like some 8th grade math, right? It turns out to just be 2v minus s minus a half, where v is your vote share and s is your seat share. That would be on the nose what efficiency gap is exactly if you had equal voter turnout in every district. If you don't, honestly, that just turns out to be some random noise added to this formula. So what is efficiency gap? It's that plus a little random noise term coming from voter turnout, which I'm happy to unpack for you if you're interested. Okay, so let's do a quick example. Suppose I got 60% of the vote and 60% of the seats in a state, right? That sounds fair. Efficiency gap doesn't like that very much. So let's take a quick look. So that's v and s are both 0.6. So 2v is 1.2. Stop me when I screw up the arithmetic. Minus 0.6 is 0.6. Minus a half is 0.1, right? I think I did that right. Mathematician, you agree? Yeah. So that's an efficiency gap of 10%. And remember, the efficiency gap guys say more than 0.08 and you're a gerrymander. Okay? So any state in which a party gets 60% of the votes and 60% of the seats is a presumptive gerrymander by the lights of efficiency gap. Yeah. Okay. Are we clear on these? So both of these are supposed to measure partisan advantage, structural partisan advantage. All right, so now, prior to the sampling approach, you were supposed to use these alone and look for plans with low numbers. But now, what I think is cool about the sampling approach is it's not like, hey, forget mean median, hey, forget efficiency gap. It's, hey, now we have a baseline for comparison according to your state and your voters and your rules for how big you should expect those to be. Okay, so a couple of remarks. So I think now we understand what's going on in these pictures is the mean median score. I tell you which plan and which distribution of votes. SEN-W is a weighted average of Senate outcomes from 2010 and 2016. Okay, which? US Senate.
I'm confused. How can a redistricting map affect a U.S. Senate outcome?
It can't. So I'm using the US Senate outcome to understand where Democratic and Republican voters are.
Okay.
Right?
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, thanks.
Yeah. Quick point. Why use a Senate outcome? Why not use a congressional outcome, presidential outcome, attorney general, or something else? Congressional returns have the problem that they're uncontested races, where you want to impute results, that there are variable incumbency statuses. So there's all kinds of sort of messiness in the data that needs to be cleaned up that can be done in some standard ways, but why not deal with a race that doesn't have those issues? It is thought that president returns are less predictive for congressional races than Senate returns. So this is a sort of common choice of a good, stable proxy for partisan preference. And I did a weighted average of 2010 and 2016 to sort of wipe out, well, I mean, Toomey was one of the candidates in both of those years, but with a different challenger, and was an incumbent in one year, not the other, so it was just supposed to sort of average out other kinds of anomalous effects. Also, one of those is a presidential year, so it had bigger turnout, so I weighted the two to equalize turnout. Anyway, that was the choice here, SEN-W. Any questions about that? Right, because as I was saying before, if you want to understand anything about partisan performance, you need votes. So you can only take one of these districting plans and overlay it on some distribution of votes. Right? Yeah, I mean, you could make a big model of lots of elections worth of past votes, or you could do something simpler. And for my analysis, I found Senate results to work pretty cleanly and pretty well. Okay, yeah.
How did you assign the precinct tallies to voting tabulated districts when they don't actually have any political data assigned to them? What was the actual?
When they don't have geometry assigned to them, is that what you mean?
No. The voting tabulated districts don't have any voting data attached to them.
Right, or dually.
BTDs aren't actually aligned with the precincts.
They were in 2011, and then they drifted. So yeah, that was a real problem. Yeah, they were initially. so that was a real problem. And what we ended up, so the state of affairs in Pennsylvania, as I said, is a mess. The Secretary of State doesn't know where the precincts are. The Democrats and the Republicans, each separately, the legislative Democrats and Republicans, maintain precinct geometry that they think is accurate by calling up their buddies in the various counties. It's all very shifty, like here in my trench coat, I have some shapefiles kind of thing. And so what we actually had to do because of the short time frame was just like call around and find someone who could give us their best guess of current precinct geometries, which is like a scandalous state of affairs, if you ask me. But we did double check by, so you can, okay, so precincts have names, and by matching up names, you can get a kind of double check on, because precincts will have moved, and we were able to look at, when we got shapefiles that we thought were the best available to us in a short time frame, we were able to look at where things were, match up names, and verify that things sort of looked reasonably correspondent. But yeah, it's a scandalous.
So the precinct names are the polling place.
Yeah.
But in 2006, so I'm familiar with the Virginia thing, and the PDTs don't actually match up with the 2011 precincts.
Yeah.
And they definitely don't match up with 2016 anything. So
Yeah.
you have a mismatch between your unit here and the actual data. But
Yeah,
I'm certain you did the best you could.
Yes,
But
and
there's an error there, right?
there's a definite potential source of error there. But we did do a whole bunch of like sanity checks, plausibility double checks to sort of bound the error a little bit. I should say, of the different states that I've worked with, Texas is by far the best at this. The Travis County Clerk's Office maintains like spotless, shiny data that they can give you within a day or two. I mean, it's, just states vary enormously in how accessible and how clean the data is. And I hope that all the light that's being shown on gerrymandering right now will result in better data practices going forward.
So in your consulting work, have you ever used just straight number of seats? So given, imagine a voting distribution looks like the Senate distribution. That's going to then generate under a current plan a certain number of seats.
So here's the cool thing about efficiency gap, which its makers did not intend, but which is why I love using it this way. It is essentially showing you that. So let me argue why. So look at, here you see something like a bell curve, and here you see something like several. Why? What's going on here? So remember what efficiency gap is. It's a formula in S and V plus noise. So V, because I've fixed the vote distribution, V doesn't change. So what are the different spikes? That's when the number of seats changes. So this is essentially just a histogram of how many seats are given to Democrats under the plan. And that like weird noise term coming from differential turnout turns spikes into bell curves. It's pretty cool, right? So it gives us a way to essentially just measure the seat outcome in a way that's slightly spread out so that you can visualize it better. Yeah, pretty cool, right? Definitely an unintended side benefit of the definition of efficiency gap. Right, so yeah, so what's going on here? So I can tell you that, I think I included the chart, yeah. So if you look at those plans, so that's Terzai-Scarnati, the 2011 plan, and the governor's plan. I also ran numbers, of course, on the remedial plan, but after submitting the report because the remedial plan came last, so it's not in the table. But these are how many Democratic seats you get under each of those plans. Remember, there's 18 in all. So the Republican-made plans are giving 4 or 5 seats to Democrats under the Senate voting distribution, while the governor's plan is giving 6 or 7, which isn't 9, even though it's like a 50-50 vote, by the way, right? And then you can see the initial efficiency gaps. So remember that the efficiency gap guys say 0.08 is the threshold for a gerrymander. So the governor's plan is a Republican gerrymander, apparently, under that way of thinking. Of course, I think it isn't, because if you actually look at the space of possibilities, what you'll see is it's quite hard to get the efficiency gap down near 0 in Pennsylvania today with its actual distribution of voters, right? You'd need to really gerrymander to do it. You see what I'm arguing?
That's because the Democrats are scattered across the state.
Oh, so usually people blame the opposite. Usually people say it's because the Democrats are huddled for warmth in cities, is how Pam Carlin puts it. So usually people use the phrase Democrats pack themselves into cities. And actually, like, this is one of the things that my research group is very actively studying right now. We think it's completely not understood what it is about the distribution of Democrats that makes them underperform in redistricting plans, but it is something geometric. I have some partial results on that I'd be happy to share.
But in your example with the
Yeah.
squares,
Yeah.
the oranges are really scattered a lot, which is why
Great.
it's so hard.
But
to
that's
get-
part of
to
my
get
like propaganda campaign to convince people that they're wrong about this. Democrats pack themselves. So I think people have misunderstood that. I think actually the more clustered you are, the better you'll perform as a minority party in redistricting, which is really like the opposite of conventional wisdom. But I have some evidence that backs up my view. Yeah.
It seems that you were, in using the evidence, you were testing it against random plans. It's just really easy to gerrymander clumps. Like really, really easy.
Yeah, okay, but it's also easy to produce proportional performance when you have clumps, and very hard when you don't. Clumps are the easiest to control. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I don't need to say more about this, but I did want to say something about the. I mentioned that even when you don't have mixing, that there's a statistical test. So notice I have p-values here. I have like some sort of assertion of statistical significance that these are gerrymandered maps. So let me tell you how that story goes. You all know what p-values are, but I'm going to say it anyway. It bounds the chance that an outcome could be observed by chance under the null hypothesis. So here, the null hypothesis is that a particular redistricting plan was selected uniformly at random among plans satisfying traditional principles at least as well. Okay, and so, of course, you can publish in a lot of fields with p's of less than 0.05. Some people think that's too generous and you should take p less than 0.01. But look at the numbers that you get here. That is some statistical significance, right? And it's telling you that it's very unlikely that a plan could be as pro-Republican skewed by these metrics as it is just by, as these ones are, if selected just by the stated principles of the court.
How should we interpret the next column with p-values bigger than 1?
Yeah, so these are bounds that you get. I'll show you the theorem on the next slide.
I see.
So I'm telling you p is less than 1.41, which means there is no evidence at all to think this is a pro-dem gerrymander. Okay, so p bounds over 1 are giving you no information at all.
Okay.
Yeah. Make sense? Okay. Yeah, here's the theorem. So let me just say, it's a great theorem. Let me just say really quickly what's going on. So this is a recent theorem by Chikina, Fries, and Pegden, who are some researchers at Carnegie Mellon and Pitt. It's called the square root of 2 epsilon test, and it says, for any reversible Markov chain with stationary distribution, pi, you can examine a plan. Oh, they invented this for gerrymandering, by the way, but it's a general theorem about Markov chains. You can examine a plan under the null hypothesis that it was drawn from the distribution pi as follows. Fix a score, maybe efficiency gap, mean, median, or your favorite score. Take a whole bunch of steps, they don't care how many. Compare the score of your initial plan to the scores observed in your ensemble. If your initial plan is in the most extreme epsilon fraction, then you can reject the null hypothesis with p bounded by square root of quantity 2 epsilon. That's amazing. There's no hypothesis on the topology of the state space. It doesn't have to be connected. There's no kind of irreducibility assumption. Like, this is just a remarkably general and flexible theorem.
Any real values for
Isn't that great? Yeah. I'm just going to leave that up for a second to see if you want to ask questions about it, because I find that even talking to mathematicians, even talking to people in the field of random walks, it takes like a while to believe what this theorem is saying because it sounds too good to be true. But it's right. The proof is short. It's published in PNAS. I encourage you to, the proof is like a half page. what's so remarkable here is thinking of it, as is often the case with math theorems. Right? And so the paper is called Assessing Significance in a Markov Chain Without Mixing. Right? And so it's giving you some statistical significance even if you don't know that you've walked long enough to be approaching the stationary distribution. And I want to emphasize two things. I've used this theorem two ways. One is with just a simple random walk, flip, 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 like you heard me talk about before, where the stationary distribution is the uniform distribution. And second, you can use this with the Metropolis-Hastings version of MCMC, because that's still reversible, right? Where the stationary distribution is the Gibbs distribution. It applies to both. It's just that cool.
So when I asked my
Yeah.
question earlier, I wasn't thinking so much about mixing, but about getting stuck. Like you were just
Right, okay, yeah.
But you said that you tried several different starting points,
Yeah.
so you could check it in practice. But is
The
there a theory to tell you that you won't get stuck? And you can
No,
just
what
keep
people
it?
do is, they do tempering and annealing and so on. So the Duke team runs for a long time at high temperature and then cools. We could talk more about how that goes, but yeah, people worry about getting stuck for sure. Okay, any questions about this? All right, so what's nice about this is it gives you a rigorous way to say, I'm really confident that your map isn't this Republican just by chance, in the case of the Pennsylvania maps. Okay, and then this is, I think, my last slide or close to it. There are surprises when you do this kind of analysis. So here's something that I found really surprising about Pennsylvania. So take a look. This is the vote distribution from the 2016 presidential contest in Pennsylvania, where Trump was a surprise winner. And this is the Senate race that year. And what I want you to notice is very similar vote totals. Yet, if you take that remedial plan and you lay it over the vote totals from Prez, you get 8 Dem seats out of 18. But over the Senate vote, you get only 5. And this comes back to this point about where the voters are. It's super interesting. I think it's really poorly understood. I'm really happy that now the court case is done because I can start publishing on this stuff now. I had to wait until that was settled. But what that's telling us is, it's not that, as I like to say, it's not that Democrats, cast their presidential ballot, got up and moved to cities before casting their Senate ballot. These are the same people voting on the same day on the same ballots. Obviously there's some ticket splitting going on in both directions, but something about the layout of Trump preferences is really quite different from the layout of Toomey preferences, and it causes these radically different bottom line outcomes. And that's just a research question, is to understand how the vote distribution interacts with the partition. Okay, yeah, so this is just heuristics for how you're searching well, which I could go into if folks care. Like, without mixing theorems, how can you be confident that you're really seeing much of the space? But I'll just close with some goals. So the hope is to work with states to clarify their rules and how to operationalize them, because sometimes the rules don't make sense taken literally. So how do you even quantify incoherent rules or conflicting rules? Work with states to record and supply cleaner input data. Create dual graphs for all the states and many cities, and share in a public repository. We'll be working on that starting this summer. Build tools to convert election results into a geometric format. Recruit MCMC specialists to optimize your search algorithms. And that's a pretty good set of goals. So that's pretty ambitious research program and sort of policy advocacy. And that's big for me. Study the geometry and topology of that whole state space of plans. There's a lot to do there. So with that, I will thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Questions?
So you said that there are kind of two different ways you could run the MCMC algorithm, either the local version or the global version. I'm not a mathematician, so I realize I'm being imprecise. Thinking from the standpoint of a state legislature trying to actually come up with a new map, why would you prefer to do, say, a local search versus a global, or vice versa?
I would prefer a global search.
That would be my assumption also.
It cannot be done for a new state in 2.5 weeks.
Okay, fair enough.
No, I mean, I can tell you from trying. There's just the data that you have to put together is too much to wrangle. All the kind of double checks that you want to do to be sure that you're doing a good job, just it can't be done that fast. In fact, I should say the Duke team, when they did global searches for both, I wrote Talk Tomorrow, that's a relic of some other thing. The Duke team, when they did global searches for Wisconsin and for North Carolina, they would run for a week to get 20,000 maps. The local search you can run for 25 minutes to get 1 billion maps. Right, so there's a bigger time horizon that you need to do the global search, but I do think it's the more, it's what to be aiming for.
Yeah, and the distributions, I imagine, could be really different depending on that choice.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I also much prefer the soft constrained version to the hard constrained version, but interestingly, here's something fun to think about. With these local searches, 1 billion steps might sort of sound like a lot until you think about the size of the search space. It's just like unimaginably incredibly big, and 1 billion is nothing. What ends up working really well for the kinds of for these kinds of pictures and the numbers that go with them is actually here it helps you to constrain your search so much that you wildly disconnect the search space. Then you end up searching a small connected component in which you can mix really well with just 1 billion steps, right? And the theorem still applies, so you're still getting something meaningful out. So that's what ended up happening here. So these ones, I can tell you, these were constrained, well, it says on the next slide, right? They're 1 billion districting plans, at least as compact as initial plan, no more county splits. In fact, an even stronger constraint was used for county splits. It wasn't just don't split any more counties, it was any counties left intact in the initial plan stay intact. It's just a whole lot of deference to the initial plan. And that definitely disconnects the search space. You can't get from the Terzai-Scarnati plan to the governor's plan while maintaining all of those criteria. It totally disconnects the search space. And the effect of that is that you pretty quickly stabilize to a certain distribution. The longer you run your chain, the shape of the bell curve doesn't change, right? And that's like in that toy example of the 10 by 10 grid. It just doesn't take very long to mix in a sufficiently small search space, right? So here it's kind of an interesting, I don't know, paradox that took a while for me to get comfortable with, but disconnecting the search space actually helps you in the local analysis really understand what's going on. Yeah.
I wanted to make a couple of comments. I used to be a court witness in redistricting cases years ago, and then when I joined the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service, they have a policy against consulting for state agencies, and so I couldn't do it anymore. Oh. So I'm kind of old school. I was involved in the Henrico County case in the 3rd Congressional District here, and years ago in Chicago, the ward boundaries. But I just wanted to say that I love what you're doing. It's just great. It's fascinating. It's completely new to me. But I'm not on board with you about attacking the compactness scores. Mm. I recognize that what you're doing goes beyond what they do and that the eyeball test may be dying. But it's also true that if the court had simply adopted a 10-to-1 perimeter radius, area to perimeter standard, almost all of the really ugly ones would be out. Mm-hmm. It was positive racial gerrymandering that got us to this space where the courts, for the sake of the Voting Rights Act, gave up on compactness, gave up on splitting communities of interest. I and others warned that this would lead to partisan disaster because they were taking the constraints off of the legislatures of the kind of districts they could draw. And if we'd simply had that, you convinced me that they could do some partisan mischief and stay within that. But if we didn't allow, if we just insisted on a decent amount of compactness, we would make a lot of progress.
But not, wait, how does that square with this though? Like, wouldn't we just get better looking but just as extreme gerrymanders?
Just get better consultants. That's her point, right? Is that's not game proof.
Yeah.
What she's setting up.
I don't think it's game. I'm not claiming it's game proof, but I'm saying it would disallow some of the most egregious stuff. I mean, it does set a limit. So I'm just saying, if that's what the court, if you're not able to sell this to the court,
Mhm.
and they were to retreat to that, I think that would be a very positive step. And I wouldn't want people to come away from your talk thinking that it's useless
Oh.
or doesn't set a real limit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. Let me say, I love compactness, and no, but really, and I'm one of the.
Apologist.
I'm an apologist. Yeah, it's yeah. Okay, we think compactness means something else, but that's another story. I've actually been going around the country and talking to civil rights organizations and who hate compactness, and trying to convince them compactness can be their friend. And one of the sort of pieces of that campaign is better compactness scores. Like I think Polsby Popper is just dead for these reasons. I just don't think it does what it used to do because you can work around it now. But I do think there are new compactness scores, and actually I have a new preprint coming out proposing a new one, so that tells you I heart compactness. I think there are new and better compactness scores that do a better job of constraining meaningfully, right? They don't have that lakes problem or that coastline problem or some of the others. So yeah, no, and actually I coded, that's a nice thing about getting to like be in the driver's seat for these algorithms. You can code your own new ideas in and see how they work. And so I think I have a new proposal for a discrete compactness score that works on the dual graph. And so it's really nice, it plays really nicely with sampling. And so I would like to see compactness be used more widely. I would like to see the Democrats and the civil rights organizations be less afraid of it. I agree with you that any constraint on the line drawer is healthy. There's just too many degrees of freedom and too much power when you're drawing the maps. But the kind where you look at a map alone, which is essentially what Polsby Popper and Rayoc are doing, they're tracking with what you see when you look at it this way. Those I think are dead. You can work around them too effectively now. But yeah, okay. So I think we're in agreement about. I hope compactness doesn't go away. It's also very helpful that it's on the books in 37 states, and if you can build a new mathematical definition in and say, hey, that's what compactness really meant all along, then you kind of win. Because it's very hard to adopt new principles, but if you can repurpose old ones, that's extremely effective.
Thanks so much.
I think one of the things that I found most compelling about the talk sort of really emerged at the end, which is the metric robustness, in essence, of what you're presenting, which I think as a rhetorical move vis-a-vis the court will hopefully be pretty compelling. Being able to show that robustness across what might be contentious or controversial metrics is really important. So my question is, you're pretty reticent here to suggest that this type of sampling or resampling strategy is one that could be used to draw maps. The maintained position is that it's just to evaluate maps. But I wonder if that's really true, right? I mean, it might be sort of a bit of modesty here, right? So certainly, if we're intending to reject maps that are on the tails, that would
Absolutely.
suggest that maps that are closer to the center of the distribution are better than those that are further out. So why can't this be used as a first step towards drawing better maps? If you had auxiliary information about precisely where road networks are located, natural boundaries, so on and so forth.
Communities of interest, yeah.
Exactly. Why couldn't this contribute to that?
It could. I would just say that it has to be iterative because the algorithm's dumb about a lot of things that would be important to humans. But I could totally envision the following kind of thing. Somebody draws a map. You do this analysis to mutate the map into a position that passes the test. Then you hand it back to the map maker and say, make this more reasonable by human standards, and maybe you iterate, right? I think that is possible, could be healthy. I wanted to do it in Pennsylvania, but it seemed important to firewall the analysis from the map production in that case, in the sort of legal context. But if you weren't working in the context of a lawsuit, I think that would be a very healthy thing to do. There's a political scientist named Joey Chen, maybe known to many people in this room, who's done a whole lot of expert testimony in recent redistricting cases. And he has the reputation of using computer sampling, but he doesn't do anything like MCMC. He has a totally different process for making maps that doesn't have any kind of characterization of how they sit in the space of maps. But Chen's maps have been, so his ensembles will typically be very small. They'll be like 200 maps, 200, 500 maps for reasons. But it has happened in more than one court case that people have said, well, let's grab this map out of Chen's ensemble and consider it as an alternative. So it is the case that people do think that way. I don't think that we're anywhere close to that being a good idea. But it's certainly a temptation. And I think if you had a map maker and a programmer working together, that they could converge on something interesting that way. And that might be the way of the future. When my work on this started ramping up, I was definitely thinking of courtrooms as the venue. So adjudicating gerrymandering, identifying a gerrymander and sort of saying that it had gone too far. But I've come around to thinking, especially now having worked for Governor Wolf of Pennsylvania, come around to thinking that states can hire people who can do this kind of analysis in a way to inoculate them from litigation, and that might be actually quite appealing to states in the next redistricting cycle. So that's more front-end work where what you're saying becomes more of an option, right? Yeah, you had.
I was also going to ask about like drawing maps versus, analyzing.
Yeah. A cool thing, so our team took the code base of that Chiquina Freeze pegged in group. They make theirs, it's open source, it's great. You can just download their package and start running it. And we took that and modified it. We made a Metropolis version of their thing. We did various other kinds of tweaks to it. But what's cool is that their software has an ability to produce SVGs so that you can actually watch your maps evolve through the process. I really, if this intrigues you, like, grab that and start playing with it. It's really hands-on. And so, for the Python script with which I ran that 10 by 10 grid, we looked at a lot of the maps we produced and they didn't look good because we made diagonal things count as adjacent in order to, you can sort of think about why. Actually, it's fun to think about why we did that. But that means that we were getting like, things that looked maybe a little more like the 2012 map out. If you do it without compactness constraints.
Exactly, you can introduce soft constraints.
Absolutely, 100%, yeah. But here's a cool fact, empirical fact. Do it without compactness constraints, do it with, and you get ensembles that look the same. That was a cool thing, yes. And that was just an empirical observation. That was a cool thing to notice, that the weird looking ones that we got out of that Python script didn't behave any differently in the kind of seat outcome analytics than the nice looking ones. We're hoping to build a big code base. I have a giant, like 50 student, 6-week data institute happening this summer to work on this stuff. And we're hoping to build tools coming out of that which will make the visualization a little more seamless so you can see if your plan looks reasonable and get other kinds of analytics out. It'll maybe help us understand whether we're making reasonable plans. Gary King, who's another giant in the political science world in this area, we had a great conversation about computer sampling and what's good about it, what's bad about it. And he said, memorably, I consider the computer sampling stuff to be exactly, perfectly, squarely irrelevant. It was great. I loved it. It was a great quote. And that was because he said, what matters is what a person would do, right? And the computer, that's what's legally relevant as the space of alternatives. It's other things a person might do, and the computer doesn't know anything about that. I take his point, and I think it's a really interesting one to engage. But that's something that we'll be able to explore a little more. How do the kinds of plans people make compare to the kinds of plans computers make under different kinds of energy functionals and different kinds of constraints? So that's another research question.
What's your constraint on contiguity? Anything but point contiguity?
Well, remember, these are graphs. So the contiguity, let me pull back up one of these graphs somewhere. Where did I put it? So contiguity was just that the subgraph should be connected. Let's see if I can find a graph.
But
somewhere.
not point. You just said point contiguity was excluded.
Tell me what you mean by point contiguity.
Yeah, so when the two, you just said in your random walk on the,
Mhm.
I don't know, 5x8 or whatever you were doing there,
Mhm.
the ones that are just touching,
Right.
that's point contiguity.
So that question is a question about building the dual graph. Okay, so like, imagine my 10 by 10 grid. What is the dual graph to that grid? So it's got 100 vertices, one at the center of every square, right?
Okay.
And what are the edges of the dual graph?
I see, okay.
Actually, this is a good point, though. Let me just sort of. So clearly, the squares that share an edge should be considered adjacent. And the question in the design of the dual graph is, when I have squares that meet only at a vertex, am I considering those adjacent? So that's a question about how you build this graph. Once you build this graph, totally straightforward what contiguity means. It means connected
So
subgraph.
these are centroids of your voting tabulated districts?
Yeah, they're centroids, but I don't ultimately care because in the sense that the algorithm just deals with the graph as a graph. It just cares about what's adjacent to what. It doesn't have lat long or anything like that in it anymore. So it's just ultimately the information can be recorded, and it is recorded in the way the algorithm works, in just an adjacency matrix. Right. I've certainly drawn it that way with centroids here.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
All right, we have gone over time.
Okay, yeah, thank you for
Thank
your-
you
Very
so
much, yeah.
much.
Yeah.